All right, Master Gardener trainees, this is going to be part 2 of pruning. Hopefully you started this right after part 1, or maybe because of part 1 you are just waking up from a nap. So when should you prune? Anytime to remove dead or damaged branches. Doesn't matter what time of the year that is, so those are potential hazards. Any time for very minor shaping, especially in the winter months here in Florida. Yes, we do get winter in Florida, as short as it may be or as warm as it may be, but some of our plants do go dormant. If the plant does go truly dormant, thus meaning shedding all its leaves like crepe myrtles, excuse me, or maybe for that matter a maple tree or an elm or some other plant that is deciduous, we would prune that in the winter months ideally before bud break in the spring, especially for any kind of major pruning. That's a great time, plus you can see the tree shape and biology and hazards better. You could prune it in the spring or early summer following that flush of growth and the leaves have hardened off. What do I mean by hardening off? The leaves no longer have a light green color, but have their darker normal summertime color and look more shiny or waxed over. Now, spring flowering plants such as azaleas, camellias, Indian hawthorn, will also include gardenia, those things that kind of bloom between January and around Mother's Day into maybe late May. We'll call those spring flowering. So you're writing this down, right? This may be a quiz question, boys and girls. So spring flowering plants, we'll call spring here in Florida sometime in about January and about sometime in mid to late May. That's kind of our time frame. Those are plants that bloom on the new wood first. So if we want to prune these just after they finish their major bloom of spring, whatever their spring is for those particular plants during that time window. If you prune azaleas in June, they flowered in March. If you wait too late in June, it may be starting to remove flower buds for next spring. Usually you want to try to prune these spring flowering trees and shrubs within about 4 to 6 weeks of the bloom period. That's a good rule of thumb to keep in the back of your minds at all times. So if you get a call from a client and says my azaleas aren't blooming very well, there could be some environmental issues. Nutrition, of course, comes to mind because it's pH finicky, but you may want to ask when's the last time you pruned them. A lot of people want to keep azaleas like a box, a meatball, or a pyramid. Maybe not so much a pyramid, but a meatball or a box. That means constant shearing. So usually what happens is those flower buds are removed sometime in the fall, and thus the plant won't bloom in the springtime because those flower buds were removed at the wrong time of the year. Now we have summer blooming plants. These are things that bloom usually sometime in June, July, August, into fall, etc. A lot of times these are also cold sensitive. A good example is hibiscus. So we want to prune these after frost has passed our area, because they usually bloom on current season wood, hibiscus being a very good example of this. Also, if you prune even cold hardy plants at the wrong time period in Florida, here's a crepe myrtle being crepe murdered, and it was pruned in September. I guess they like Christmas lights all year round for some weird reason. Anyhow, this was pruned in September. Now, crepe myrtles are perfectly cold hardy in central Florida. We don't have to worry about covering them and all that jazz, thankfully. But the people told the plant what to do. Yeah, that's right. Pruning is wounding, but pruning also stimulates growth. So we told the plant grow, grow, grow. Even though the days are starting to shorten up. The plant normally would start to be kind of slowing down in September. Even some of the leaves don't remain green and start turning those tinges of yellows and oranges. So a frost came by in January or freeze, and all that new growth was frozen. I've seen this happen time and time again. Now this is a deciduous tree. When should it have been pruned? Not necessarily crepe murdered, but pruned properly. I would recommend sometime in January or February before it breaks dormancy. Ideally, the desirable shape is one strong central leader to a tree. These are usually the strongest trees that we have. A good example are magnolia trees. Pine trees typically are fairly strong as well. But not all trees need to have one central leader in order to be strong. It depends on how they're attached to one another and to the trunk. Here's a sycamore tree, and you can see it has one central leader. Statistically speaking, it's one of our more wind-tolerant plants or trees for Central Florida. When can you prune trees? Anytime, just avoid those periods of that new growth flushing out. Again, that's our spring months. That can vary from species to species a little bit. Some are flushing out new growth in February, some are doing it in March, and some are doing it in April or May for that matter. Those are the times of year for those particular species not to prune them. There are all sorts of pruning problems and issues I'd like to address. People leave stubs. That usually is a source for diseases. Flush cuts. You probably remember reading that in books. It said to properly prune a branch off, cut it flush to the trunk. If you have a book like that at home, please do me a favor and pause this recording in a moment. Get to that book and do the following. Take that page of that book and tear it out. And so you're not tempted to just shove it back into the book, please put it in your paper shredder and destroy it. We haven't recommended flush cuts since the 70s. Drop crotches. That is not a dirty expression. You'll learn to embrace this particular term by the end of these modules. Ingrown branches and pinching I'll talk about later in the modules. So there are various types of pruning cuts. Some are good in these diagrams and some are bad. A thinning cut, when done right, can be good. A drop crotch, if it's done properly, is an excellent way to control height of trees or, for that matter, shrubs. Obviously, heading cuts are bad, but this is what a lot of people do to a lot of their trees and shrubs and wonder why they have problems with them. So what's a tree or, for that matter, shrub's reaction to heading cuts? It's kind of like what we do with patient Lucy's. I mean impatiens. You guys want to go by that scientific genus all the time. I keep forgetting this. So when your impatiens got leggy, you pinched them. That was a heading or topping type of a cut. And what happened is where there once was one stem, or in this case in trees and shrubs, branch, there will be multiple ones coming out at that area where it was topped or headed back. And different alternate versus opposite will flush out growth a bit differently. Here somebody had a tree, obviously it's further north, but it really doesn't matter. It's a plant with apparently weak apical dominance. So if we look at this large tree, probably the spouse was told by the other spouse, go out there and prune that so it won't be over the roof of the house. So the spouse, whichever one it was, it's an equal opportunity world out there now, went out and he or she, with probably a chainsaw, if you look very closely, look at the base and go up about a third of the way up. Can you see where the first pruning cuts were made on this tree? There once used to be one, two, three, four, roughly five large limbs to this particular tree. The idea of cutting it back to that, topping, hat racking, buckhorning, there are several terms for this, is a type of heading cut. So, we know when we break apical dominance, we tell the plant to branch out, become bushy. Is that what you want to do with most of your trees? Or shrubs for that matter? Probably not. So, out came the chainsaw and they were cut back. So now where there once was one branch or limb, there are now 6 or 7 on each of those major limbs that were, and if you can see it flushed out a whole bunch of new growth. You predicted that, right? And you can see they may have even gotten a ladder or paved somebody. Gosh, I hope they don't claim to be a professional. And here you can see where all the whip-like growth is, but you can see once again they did the same thing. They cut it back where those limbs were, and now where there once were 6 or 8, now they're 20, 30 on each. Now, doing the same thing and expecting a different result is, I didn't say that, but you did. Again, this is not the way to control tree height whatsoever. In fact, this tree is very weakened by this for a lot of reasons. First of all, we removed the woody tissue, which is stored food. We also removed the tree's ability to produce food from the leaves. Now we do this constantly with crepe myrtles. And where there once was one branch, we can see there are multiple branches there. This was predicted back in this other tree from the north even, wasn't it? So, how do we slow trees from growing so tall so fast? Especially if we don't want to do a lot of pruning. We do drop crotches. We drop the limb down to a crotch. So we slow down the tree or shrub's growth. This is usually very beneficial for most of our shrubs especially, and in some cases certain trees that we don't want to grow so big or want to prune so often, like crepe myrtles. Sometimes you'll read this in books or online or in other resources as subordination. What can happen, especially in fruit-bearing trees where we drop crotch them, is that we'll see some water sprouts forming. Those would need to be removed as those are usually not very productive and they're whip-like little branches, as you can see in the lower left-hand picture. Now on the right-hand diagram, you can see what I mean by a drop crotch. The limb to be removed is removed at an angle to a limb or a branch at a crotch. Now, you cannot bring that branch down to a toothpick-like little branch. The rule of thumb is the branch that you bring it down to should be about a minimum of 1/3 the diameter of the one you're removing. So if the one I'm removing is 1 inch across, let's say, is that diameter or circumference? Either way, 1 inch across for this class. This would need to be a minimum of 1/3 of an inch across, and on and on. If you brought that down to a little toothpick-like branch, it's kind of the expression of sending a boy out to do a man's job. What is happening here is you are manipulating hormones of the tree for your benefit. By keeping all these other buds from this branch that's a minimum 1/3 of the diameter of the one to be removed, the hormones that are being produced by those remaining buds are suppressing or preventing apical dominant issues, a breaking of that apical dominance. The plant doesn't really notice that it's happened, in other words. See? Plants have hormones. They know how to use them. And as gardeners, we know how to manipulate plants and their hormones. Sometimes it's called a reduction cut in other literature as well, but you can see here where the branch that was removed and the one that remained was about 1/3 of the diameter. This one has simply grown a little bit bigger from the diagram on the left versus the photograph on the right hand side. This would tell the plant don't grow so tall, slow down your growth, especially on hedges that we'd want to maintain at a relatively short stature. Sometimes drop crotching is called crown reduction. Don't sweat the various synonyms for the technique of drop crotching. Just know what drop crotching is and how it works. That's really the ultimate take-home message here. So I like to think of crown reduction this way. If you've ever gone to a circus or a county fair or something like that, there's inevitably a clown or somebody twisting balloons into animal shapes for children to take home with them. So let's think of those long skinny balloons that they use to twist into shapes. Orient your balloon as it were a hot dog kind of standing upright. All right? You kind of have that in your mind? What color is your balloon? I see white on mine. You could see another color. It doesn't really matter. It was just making sure you're kind of visualizing. So you have your balloon kind of sticking upward in the long skinny way up and down. So if I take that balloon and I squeeze it at the top end of the balloon furthest away from the bottom, which way is the balloon going to expand? That's right, downward. So think of removing those upper limbs that you can see in a crown reduction technique. What are you telling the plant? You're kind of squeezing it down, so to speak. Now, what would happen if I were to squeeze a balloon at the base of the balloon like you would at the base of the trunk? I would be telling it to grow up. So, depending on which way you squeeze the balloon, that's the reaction the plant will have to your pruning techniques. Thinning. Sometimes we get questions about thinning of trees, usually oak trees in particular, Quercus spus. We won't go into all the species here, obviously. When people ask me about what do I think about thinning their trees, I ask, what is your goal? Why do you want to do that? Usually the answer is so I'll get grass to grow. By and large, thinning probably won't get to the end goal of better turf. It might work temporarily for a year or two, if you're lucky, before that regrows or fills back in. It's kind of like shaving, boys and girls. It doesn't get rid of the root of the matter, so to speak. It's a constant maintenance. Rather than thinning for trying to get grass to grow under the trees, I usually recommend they plant some more shade-tolerant plants in its stead and save their money on thinning. Now, thinning for some people, when it's done properly, may end up with slightly better turf, but it can, when done properly, let me repeat that, if done properly, can mitigate some wind issues in trees to a point. But again, I can tell you the outcome of a tree in a hurricane, if a wind named event, I'm sorry I used the H word, bad, my bad. Tell me the duration of the storm, its intensity, the age of the tree, how much rainfall is going to happen, and what structural issues does the tree have, and I'll predict the outcome for you. Yeah, that was kind of sarcastic. Good job, guys. Crotching angles. Some angles are inherently strong and some are inherently weak. Those branches on the left-hand diagram are an inherently stronger arrangement onto a particular tree. U-shaped crotching angles are not necessarily bad. It's these on the right-hand side that are V-shaped that are inherently weak. What is really going on with these crotching angles is what's called codominant stems. If you remember earlier in this module, I talked about the ideal shape for a tree is to have one strong central leader. But the tree doesn't necessarily have to have one central leader in order to be reasonably strong. It's the shape of the attachment to the branches relative to one another. Look at the diagram on the left. That is a V-shaped angle. It's fairly distinctively V-shaped. What is happening is between each of those trunks is codominant. In other words, one is not a leader over the other. They're co-leaders. They're codominant. What happens in these V-shaped angles is there is bark between each of those trunks. The bark between each of those trunks acts like a natural wedge. And if this is a dicot tree, which in these cases that I'm talking about they are, dicots grow bigger in diameter each year. You remembered that from botany. So what can happen is when there's a bark inclusion between a V-shaped angle, at some point one of those two stems will fail, or trunks. In other words, this is the weakest link of a tree. Now, a lot of times a good nursery will remove these on young trees while they're training them in the nursery. You don't always get the best tree planted at your home. Unfortunately, a lot of landscape material goes to the lowest bid, and poor quality trees are planted, and then a few years later, a decade later, 20 years later, now the issues are showing up and people are wanting to try to fix it when these codominant stems are very large. These should have been fixed early on in the tree's life. Like I said, trees should be thought like children. They need to be trained when young, and a pruning program should be established and maintained. But usually a pruning program is established when a tree branch falls off to the ground. Now let's look at the codominant stems on the right. Notice it's a distinctive U-shaped angle, and there's something called the stem bark ridge. It kind of goes upward like a little mini mountain. That's kind of how I think about it. That's a relatively strong fork. It's kind of like your wishbone when you were a kid. It doesn't snap at the base, it snaps at one limb or the other. So it's not going to fail at the joint, it's going to fail further up the limb potentially. Again, tell me the strength of the storm, the duration, etc., and I can predict the outcome of your trees. Let's go back to the diagram on the left. You'll see there's a number 1 and a 2. Gosh, I sound like Lawrence Welk there for a second, didn't I? Anyhow, the angle 1 to 2 is the proper angle to remove that codominant stem properly. So what you do is, if you look at where the V shape is, go down and you see the line to where it says 2. You kind of draw an imaginary line at about a 45-degree angle off of that angle downward. Why would I want to angle my cut downward? Yes, that is to shed water off of that cut, rather than to hold on to water, which could cause disease issues in this particular plant. So let's do a little bit of a pop quiz. Is this a V-shaped angle or a U-shaped angle? It is a codominant stem. Look closely and you can see between the two branches or limbs or trunks, whatever term you wish to use, you can see it's V-shaped. And if you look down, you can kind of see the beginning of a crack. Again, this is likely the place this tree will fail and one of the stems will fall to the ground eventually. So we see a lot of trees like this. People like to buy bushy trees. I'm not sure the reason why, but I guess it's a money thing. I want the bushiest thing in the smallest pot for the least amount of money. Well, bushes should be bushy and not trees. This particular tree is a Bradford pear, which doesn't grow well in Central Florida, although I have seen some very poor examples in Brooksville. Trust me, I'd like to put them out of their misery with one pruning cut. The point is, these were planted a little further north in areas that get a lot of winter snows and ice. Predict to me the outcome of this particular plant and its long-term survival in these environments. These trees fail very frequently from ice storms and heavy wet winter storms because they have a lot of codominant stems, especially in a very small area on the trunk, all clustered within a few inches of each other. None of those are particularly strongly attached to one another. Unfortunately, this tree got widely planted after a well-known author recommended them as a beautiful flowering tree. A lot of people are feeling otherwise after experiencing them failing and breaking apart. Let's look at this particular tree. Now, we don't know exactly what species it is, but we can probably guess that has weak apical dominance by the fact it has multiple trunks. There's how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, about 10, 12. And they're all attached within about a, what, 4 foot from, 3 feet up the base and about within about 4 to 6, 7 feet up, not even. All those are very weakly attached, although we can't quite see that they're all V-shaped. We can tell by just how upright this tree is, it has to be V-shaped. Now predict to me what might happen in a windstorm if this were by your house. Yeah, this tree is likely to fail with high winds. This doesn't always have to happen during a named windstorm. This can happen when we get an afternoon thunderstorm with these downbursts. This tree is very hazardous. Now let's say I decide to chainsaw that down. I probably wouldn't take on the task, but I do. Sometimes I do stupid things. Safely, of course, right? Point is, would I recommend or not recommend a herbicide painted to the cut stump? I mentioned it has weak apical dominance, didn't I? That should be the tip-off. Yes, this needs to be treated with the appropriate herbicide. You remember those active ingredients, don't you? That'll probably come back to haunt you at some point in the future. Called the final. So I mentioned this codominant stems can form embedded bark. Uh, we will go into more detail at another time, but these become hazardous trees in the landscape is what this slide is trying to tell you, but I've already kind of beat that into you, haven't I? So here is a tree. This actually is a cedar tree, a species of some sort, and you can see where in the center part of the more upper left-hand slide, you can see where 1, 2, 3 large limbs were removed. Now, I told you what species it is, and you can look that up, but even if you didn't know, would you say that meets our maximum criteria for a mature specimen of this particular species for removal, or have we exceeded it? Remember what our maximum was, 20%. It looks more like 40, maybe 50% by just rough eyeball guesstimates. Now, as we look down a little bit closer, can you see the two codominant stems? The one on the right obviously was more successful of the two and grew larger in diameter over the course of many years. The one on the right didn't grow quite as large or quite as fast, but can you see the bark between them? That's where it was split apart in a windstorm. So here is an oak tree. Now this particular specimen has been dried down and in storage for a while, hence the bark is pulling back from the outer periphery of the trunk. But you can see the stem on the right is quite a bit larger than the stem on the left. But you can see the bark in between the two codominant stems. That's called a bark inclusion. At one point, this smaller one on the left should have been removed properly. What do you think about this tree? Anyone here tick, 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 tick? You should. This tree is likely to split at any moment. Wind or not, maybe. Yet the average person doesn't notice these kind of defects in their trees, in their landscape, or for that matter, around their neighborhoods. And also people get very emotionally attached to these various plants. Here's a guy. Here, as we can see, he's standing on a tree with a codominant stem, and it probably has a bark inclusion. Do you think he can split it apart, or that's too big of a job for even a guy that size to do? Well, it was possible. Obviously, this was a little staged, but I think you get the point. With enough pressure downward, this tree was easily split apart by the man jumping on it. And here you can kind of see the bark between the two stems. This was the natural wedge that forced the two apart with a little additional pressure by some jumping up and down by the man. Now, again, these things wouldn't be a problem in the back 40, like in this particular shot. This is on somebody's property, and they may not even know this happened if they have a large piece of property. But obviously, this would be a lot of heartache if your car was parked underneath it, or there was a home, or a road, or some other issue. A tree similar to this failed in a large park in Hillsborough County well over a decade ago now, and a woman was sitting on a park bench under the tree. Sadly, she perished when this tree failed when she was sitting there. Kind of an episode of 6 Feet Under, if you know that HBO show. And that's what happens sometimes. Kaboom! The overall is you would string cables in between all those various branches up there with the idea of taking off the weight of the stems off of the codominant uh, trunks down below. My personal and professional opinion is unless that tree was planted by someone of major historic significance, and I do not include myself on that list of such people, but if it were Abraham Lincoln or President Jefferson or somebody else, maybe your favorite rock and roll band, I suppose. But again, this is on somebody's yard, this is near a home, a road, cars, sidewalks, etc. This is a hazardous tree. Cabling and bracing does not really mitigate a lot of the issues. In fact, if anything, it kind of tips off everybody that you acknowledge there are issues with this tree that you're not fully addressing. So we can see it was splitting apart here. Then he showed me yet another photograph, and he looked downward. Those are the same trunks, and you can see his feet in the lower right hand picture. You can see how this tree is literally falling apart. After the talk, and he didn't even have to get very far with the pictures when he said, I think I already know the answer, but let me give it one last, college try for a green light to save it. He knew that this tree needed sadly to be removed, but necessarily so. It's better to prune in 2 or 3 steps rather than one. But a lot of times if people do hire a professional arborist, they want to see them only once. So they say, take all this off right now, and then the idea is that they'll never have to see him again or pay him another penny. Again, pruning is wounding. Pruning is stressful. Trees do not heal. It's better to do this over the course of 2 or 3 or 4 years, or every other year, or some other variation of that, rather than all in one fell swoop. It didn't get that big or out of shape overnight. Don't try to fix it in one day. Embedded bark or bark inclusions are major problems, as I have said before. The diagram on the right, or the left, excuse me, A, has a embedded bark. Notice a V-shaped angle. Notice the one on the right-hand side labeled B. That is a branch bark ridge, BBR. This is not very weak in its attachment. It's actually a relatively strong attachment of a branch to a tree. So here's kind of where the rubber meets the road in pruning off branches. If you look at the one in the middle, the flush cut, that was a technique that was written about for many, many years in many, many books up until the middle 70s or thereabout, when the research finally concluded that flush cuts were more damaging to trees than cutting outside the branch bark ridge, keeping that intact, or outside the branch collar, as you will hear me talk about in a moment. Again, flush cut, the idea was that that was the right way to do it, and then after we cut that, we would immediately put on a pruning paint or a wound aid or some other weird terminology. Usually it was a tar-based product, usually what I like to call black guck. The black guck is usually based on petroleum. Many of the petroleum distillates in that particular type of products is toxic to the cells that actually aid in sealing. Notice I said sealing because trees do not heal. So the research proved that the black guck and also flush cuts were verboten. Although I do still occasionally run across some poorly written things out there, usually on the internet, that still recommend it. This hasn't been a recommended pruning practice since somewhere in the 70s. Now, let's look at the diagram on the left-hand side where it says correct cut. Notice we leave the branch bark ridge intact and we're pruning what is called outside the collar. I'll show some photographs in a moment. But you don't want to leave too much of a stub of a branch. That area will eventually die off and that can cause infection into the major part of the tree. So here is a diagram of what I'm trying to say. If you look at this, kind of put your thumb up there with me on just to the left or right, whichever is easier for you. I have my left hand up just to the left of the particular diagram here. And your fingers are simulating the tree trunk and your thumb is simulating the branch. So the the collar region is kind of that thickened area at that last knuckle of your thumb as it is approaching your wrist. We would prune if we were to take off our thumb, not at that first knuckle, but right at that second knuckle going towards your wrist. Notice how it's kind of swollen there. That would be the proper way to also remove a branch. So it's kind of an easy way to remember that when you forget, where do I prune? So you can make an imaginary line kind of going down perpendicular to the trunk, and you can, if you remember back in your school days, bisect the angle, roughly at about a 30 or so degree angle out of there outside the branch collar. So here we have a young tree of some sort, maybe a maple tree. Can you see the collar? Can you see where the branch, go to the right hand side of the picture, and the branch is angling at about a 45-degree angle to the trunk. Now go down and follow your thumb down. You see a couple little branches coming off, and you see a couple little spurs like that. And all of a sudden you get to the area where the branch is still fairly small in diameter. All of a sudden it quickly swells a little bit. That swollen area is called the collar. You will prune that branch outside of that collar, just to the right of the collar in this particular photograph. Now, being a small branch like that, it probably is roughly the size of your thumb. You can probably use a pair of hand clippers, no problem. If it were larger, you would do what is called a three-step pruning cut, which I'll show later. So it's later, isn't it? So let's look at if that were a small enough cut. You're pruning outside the branch collar with a pair of hand clippers, or maybe even a lopper. Because you're able to support that branch and you're cutting it so quickly, it probably will not tear that bark into the trunk. Now, if the branch is too large to do that, your first cut is always what is called an undercut. Notice it's about a foot or so away from your final cut. You go under by roughly a third of the diameter of the branch. No, I do not sit there and measure it with great precision. If it's only a quarter of the way, that's pretty good too. A little scratch isn't going to work. The second cut is past the first cut all the way through. Now, some of you are wondering, why do I cut underneath first? Remember, I don't want that bark to rip, especially if this is a very weighted branch and I can't necessarily easily support it, or I have a chainsaw too close to my hands to do such a thing. Then my final cut is made all the way through the branch just outside the branch collar. So here is a diagram in a slightly different way. Here is an obviously large branch, especially in relation to this particularly large tree trunk. The first cut is made underneath. It can be done with a handsaw. In this case, it would probably have to be a very large bow saw. It can be done with a chainsaw, yes. So about a third of the way up. Notice the second cut is past the first and it's all the way through. Now the third cut, because I don't want my hands near a chainsaw or my buddies, I can, because I reduced the weight of that, that probably will not tear into the trunk tissue when that's removed properly. Now, here is somebody that did not make the undercut or didn't make it properly or all the way through. It's a little hard to tell, but somebody needed to put an arrow on this to show the problem, huh? I stole this one off the internet. Looks like a first grader's project with some tape or something. But the question is, how professional was this person or company to make that large of a wound? Now, this poor wound will probably never seal properly in the remainder of this particular tree's life. This tree may, by and large, will probably become a hazard in the future as disease-causing organisms are likely to attack this particular large wound. So, what's occurring inside the tree and why is a branch collar kind of important? In the spring, the branch grows over the trunk, as you can kind of see in this upper two diagrams. In the fall, the trunk grows over the branch, so it's kind of interlocking itself, kind of like putting your fingers together if you were praying or something like that, or worrying about something. Here is kind of that in a longitudinal section. You can kind of see how the trunk is wrapped around the branch and the branch is wrapped around the trunk. And you can see the area on the upper right hand side of the photograph, not at the branch but outside that to the right left. You can really see where it's been wrapped around several times over many years, these layers. This is how trees hold on to branches. They're not just kind of stuck in there like your artificial Christmas tree limbs into a hole. Their trunk is wrapped around the branch and the branch is wrapped around the trunk. It's interlocked. You can see kind of where the swollen collar would be. If we look at the upper right hand side of the picture where it's kind of cut flat, if you go just about a couple inches down from there, you can see where the collar begins and ends at that point. Here it is in a slightly different plant. But again, you can see where the wrapping around it has occurred and you can see the swollen branch collar. If I were to flush cut that, that would be almost perpendicular to the trunk of that particular branch or limb. We can see how we would be cutting into trunk tissue. By cutting outside the branch collar, in this case to the right of the branch collar, we're only cutting off branch tissue. It also is the smallest diameter cut to remove that limb properly. Again, never cut a branch flush with the trunk. And avoid any company that says they would do that and put on pruning paint afterwards to seal it. Again, which of the two is strong? That's correct. You got right away the one on the left. The one on the right is fairly strong, but not as strong as one central leadered tree. I pretty much covered that, so we'll go past it. All right, included bark or a branch bark ridge. It's the upper part of the photograph, not the ones right kind of at the lower part. Kind of see that little mountain as I said a little earlier? That's a branch bark ridge. So this has a collar. This is a codominant stem though. Let's conclude part 2 of pruning and join me in module 3, hopefully right away. If not, enjoy your nap.